Welcome back to the second part of our two-part study on the Gracie Hunter and IQ Wrestler Kazushi Sakuraba. Let's get you up to speed from where we left off. In the first part of the study, we looked back on Kazushi Sakuraba's childhood, fascinated with the anime character Tiger Mask and the professional wrestler Tiger Mask. It inspired him into freestyle wrestling in high school and then into the UWFI pro wrestling organization, where he learned the skills of catch-as-catch-can wrestling under Billy Robinson. After transitioning into MMA with an entrance into the UFC to win the UFC Japan heavyweight tournament, he moved on to Pride Fighting Championships to continue his legacy. In part 1, we examined how he used his tricky striking, his solid single and double leg takedowns, and unorthodox and exciting guard passing attempts, and leg locks to both submit and pass the guard to wage battle against his opponents and entertain the fans. We left off discussing where after passing the guard, Sakuraba would often look to attack with armbars, and his use of his armbar attacks is where we will resume part 2. We'll then examine his tendency to give up his back in turtle, the infamous use of the double wrist lock, also known as the kimura, and his legacy on the sport and entertainment side of the industry. Now let's begin by looking at Sakuraba's tactics after taking down his opponents and getting past their guard, where he'd start to work towards submissions. Sakuraba's catch wrestling coach, Billy Robinson, would describe the human body as being like a ladder, and that you don't go from the bottom rung to the top rung in one step. Instead, you attack the ankle, the knee, the hip, the waist, the arm, and make your way to the neck. So, with the body as the ladder, you climb the ladder with attacks, keeping your weight and pressure on the opponent, making it painful and as uncomfortable for them as possible while still remaining in control. And this is where, after clearing an opponent's legs or getting into side control or mount position, Sakuraba would often look to attack with an armbar, and with 9 successful submission victories, it made it his most effective finishing hold. And along with being an effective submission, Sakuraba would also look at the armbar as a control position. He states here you can stop to have something to eat or drink once you have control of the arm. And Sakuraba would look for this control position once he'd established a pin from side control, where he would focus on the near arm first, and after isolating it with his chest, step over the head and fall back for the submission. Sometimes called a snap armbar due to the speed at which the technique is executed, the near side armbar may not be as common in MMA, but Sakuraba would make sure to threaten both arms from all positions. This includes the more traditional setup where, after moving into mount, he would work to slide his knees up under the opponent's arms and isolate their elbows and swing through into S-mount. Or, while still in side control, he would isolate the far arm and immediately swing through into the S-mount position, and then, once he'd secured the arm, he would patiently work to break the opponent's grip by twisting and rotating the arm, attacking the opponent's locked hands. Although Sakuraba would sometimes dive for armbars immediately after getting past the opponent's legs, causing him to lose position. On one hand, this may seem consistent with the common notion that catch wrestling prioritizes submission over position, but that saying isn't entirely accurate. As for starters, there are plenty of punishing rides in catch wrestling and folk-style wrestling, like the double leg ride, the wrist ride, or other leg rides, that are distinct uses of positions that can be held to wear down and beat on an opponent, and also be used to turn them over for pins and win a match, which of course makes them highly valuable in the sport. Instead, it might be more accurate to say that catch wrestling prioritizes control above all, with an added distinction that it considers submissions as a position that allow you to establish a dominant control. As what better way to control someone than having the addition of pain compliance and the immediate threat of a break from whatever hold your opponent is locked up with. An example of this with the armbar is that once Sakuraba had his catch on the arm, he would use it to break the posture and control the position of his opponent while still executing the submission. And this philosophy complements the belief in catch wrestling that they have the ability to gain this level of control of catching a submission from any conceivable position they're in at any given time. So no matter where Sakuraba found himself, there would always be the threat of a submission attempt that could keep him in control no matter what his opponent was working towards or where they were in relation to his body. And if he did lose the catch on the arm while attempting the armbar and end up on the mat, he would go to his knees and give up back exposure in a turtle, which then became an area that he was surprisingly very capable of launching counter-offensive attacks from. In fact, one of the most defining and unique characteristics of Sakuraba was this tendency to roll to his knees instead of more conventionally establishing a guard or body scissors. At the time, this was highly uncommon, as the prevailing jiu-jitsu principle said that if you turned your back when you're on the ground, then you would immediately be giving it up to the opponent for a guaranteed rear naked choke. But as a holdover from his wrestling roots, where having your shoulders pinned would lose the match, he would bridge and roll and stay in a tight ball, bringing his elbows and knees together as soon as he hit the mat. Although not without its risks, once in that position, as his opponents would habitually move to take his back, it would open up his main avenue of escape. As they stepped closer, Sakuraba would seek out a single leg takedown from the opponent by rolling or monitoring where their legs are at all times. It was a method that proved to be unique to his style at the time and revolutionary. But more recently, even jiu-jitsu great Ryan Hall has stated that 3/4 of what people are doing with the guard could be replaced by coming up on a single leg and learning not to be terrible at it. And Sakuraba was showing how effective that strategy could be very early on. If opponents did take his back, he also defended it in a manner that was counterintuitive to the jiu-jitsu mindset, which is to put your shoulders onto the mat in an effort to block or scrape opponents off your back. But Sakuraba would do the opposite, turning his shoulders away from the mat, often causing his opponents to fall off his back or allowing him to keep defending hooks and grips and scramble back to the top position. So by remaining in a tight ball with his elbows and knees close together, ready to roll into the choke, he was able to shuck many fighters off of his back, reverse position, and end up landing on top. And while always rolling to his knees in defensive position, it also facilitated his ability to get back to his feet and not be stuck underneath his opponent. But turning his back on the opponent wasn't simply for defense or escapes. Sakuraba would use it to bait his opponents into one of his most potent attacks, which is one account of where the Wigan's snake pit earned its name, as it was said that like a snake, if you threw a Wigan wrestler to the ground, he would turn to his belly and bite you. The bite in this case was the double wrist lock, a move that would be involved in Sakuraba's most iconic victories over the Gracie clan. Known as the kimura in jiu-jitsu, that name comes from a pivotal win over a Gracie when the judoka Kimura beat and broke Helio Gracie's arm with the judo version of the technique called the udigarami, and the Gracies then renamed it after Kimura himself. The double wristlock technique is a powerful hold that allows tremendous control over the opponent's posture while attacking the shoulder, elbow, and wrist, allowing it to be used as a takedown or to defend takedowns, and Sakuraba would finish from side control, use it to go from standing to the ground, or transition to the back and arm bars as well as defensively. The versatility of this move as both an offensive and defensive tool helped illustrate the principle in catch wrestling that submissions are also positions, as highlighted by the fact that if you were behind Kazushi Sakuraba but he had the double wrist lock in place, then he was still technically in a more dominant position. Now, the double wrist lock and the kimura are mostly the same technique that attacks the opponent's elbow and shoulder joint. However, multiple variations exist of both methods, but the catch wrestling double wrist lock will traditionally emphasize gripping around the wrist joint with a tendency to use the thumb to apply pressure to the opponent's wrist as well. So much so that you can attack with a wrist lock on the opponent as well as a shoulder lock, which is partly where it gets the double wrist lock name. But with MMA gloves and hand wraps reinforcing the wrist, isolating an attack on it becomes difficult, so Sakuraba generally grabbed above the wrist. And another tendency of the double wrist lock compared to the kimura is that it keeps the opponent's wrist short or close to their armpit to make it more challenging to straighten back out. It also emphasizes keeping the catching hand near the opponent's armpit and working towards bringing the other wrist into the waiting grip. And once the grip is secured, Sakuraba would drive it up towards the back of the opponent's neck. This was such a strong move for Sakuraba, you could see him often just switching from one arm to the other of the opponent's, consistently cycling through his double wrist lock attacks, never letting go of the opportunity to turn the moment against the attacker. As well as switching between arms, Sakuraba would also use the double wrist lock to switch between techniques. In one of the best examples of this against Quinton Rampage Jackson, he used the grip to transition into a leg entanglement where he began to attack the knee bar before transitioning off onto a back attack where he finished Quinton with a rear naked choke. Although rudimentary in its form, this sort of transitional attack is common in no-gi modern grappling. But perhaps the most iconic victory Sakuraba scored with the technique was against Renzo Gracie, where after Renzo took Sakuraba's back standing and thinking he was in a dominant position, he shifted his weight in an attempt to put his hooks in on the back, and Sakuraba spun around and in the process broke Renzo Gracie's arm, who conceded the match without tapping. And the rivalry between Sakuraba and the Gracie family has to be one of the most iconic in the sport, and led to one of the most epic matches of all time. After beating Royler Gracie with the double wrist lock, Sakuraba would then face off against Royce Gracie. The Gracies insisted on special rules for this match, with no time limit and as many 15-minute rounds as needed until one fighter was victorious. With Royce entering the bout wearing the traditional gi, which Sakuraba would use against him on multiple occasions, the two would fight for an incredible 6 rounds, or an hour and a half, until Roy and Gracie eventually threw in the towel in between rounds. Even more incredibly, Sakuraba would then fight again later in the evening against Igor Vovchanchin, who entered the ring with a record of 41-2, and in which Sakuraba lasted an additional 15 minutes against him in an unimaginable display of skill, heart and grit. But eventually, a Gracie would cleanly get the best of an aging Sakuraba late in his career, as Hallett Gracie won a decision over the family nemesis. And although we've spoken extensively on the highlights of Sakuraba's career, another notable trait was his remarkable ability to endure punishment at the hands of his opponents and to continue fighting. He would also frequently face much larger opponents, and although he would often be victorious against them, disproving another misconception about catch wrestling that it only works for larger grapplers, when he couldn't get the upper hand, he took some tremendous beatings. And although he did seem to have this superhuman-like ability to endure these thrashings in his early days, they inevitably took a toll on his body. And with promoters still booking him in high-profile matchups, it wasn't getting any easier for him. And this led to a 5-fight losing streak before Sakuraba finally hung up the gloves. So as for the legacy of Sakuraba, in terms of the catch wrestling versus jiu-jitsu rivalry, that has mostly been left behind in today's grappling landscape. While catch wrestling competitions and organizations are still active, jiu-jitsu has exploded in popularity and incorporated a lot of the definitive techniques of catch wrestling into their arsenal. Recently, jiu-jitsu competitor Keenan Cornelius has even stated that no-gi is imploding because of leg locks and wrestling. So while the differences between grappling styles have become blurrier, the major distinctions are now more evident between rule sets. The concept of turning your back to stand has now become a staple technique in MMA, with MMA grappling looking very different to jiu-jitsu in a gi, which is again different from no-gi submission grappling. In terms of competition, after retiring from MMA, Sakuraba still continued to compete in grappling matches, even starting his own organization, Quintet. And it was on this promotion that his son, Saku Jr., made an appearance, winning via double wrist lock. And Sakuraba still also competes in professional wrestling, where the storylines are scripted to ensure entertainment. And Sakuraba can still showcase his playfulness in the ring and dedication to entertaining the crowd that elevated his character from mere sportsman to that of an artist, perhaps even to that of a magician or jester, as the feats he accomplished defy reality and are more akin to a mythical manga hero than a regular fighter. And while pro wrestling insists on being fantasy, and the sporting aspect of MMA insists on being a reality, Sakuraba was able to create the right mix of the two, where with the right set of eyes, those elements of storytelling, mythology, and fantasy can be naturally drawn out of and emerge from the real sporting competition that serves to elevate them to the tales of legend. And that concludes part 2 of this video on Kazushi Sakuraba. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a comment, like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more. If you want more info, go to sonnybrown.net. Thank you.